if we start off, can you introduce yourself, your political role, your party? Is that all right? And then we'll take it from there.
Hi everybody, my name is Gideon Amos. I'm the Member of Parliament for Taunton and Wellington, Liberal Democrat. I'm also the front bench spokesperson for housing and planning.
Great, welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm Danny Beales. I'm the new Labour MP for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, which is in West London. Be most known for its rather colourful previous incumbent, Mr. Boris Johnson, who's quite a low-key figure. And I kind of grew up in Uxbridge and experienced homelessness twice growing up, and time in temporary accommodation, which you might touch upon, which I think is kind of one of the reasons I'm here. It's an issue I'm very passionate about, championing in Parliament, and I'm a backbench Labour MP, but a member of the Health Select Committee.
Brilliant.
Hello everyone, my name's Natalie MP. I'm standing in for Natalie Bennett, and I'm a Green Party councillor in Tower Hamlets. So yeah, you wanted one Natalie and you got the other Natalie.
All right, we'll have any
I'm not
Natalie.
pretending to be anywhere near as important as Natalie Bennett, but I am hoping to try and represent some of the views of the councillors in the room, because I think there are quite a few of us, and I think it's quite nice to have a range of different levels of government talking about this really important issue. Yeah.
So I guess the first question is, what personally, and this might be easier for some of you else, but what personally motivates you to engage with such a political thorny issue of temporary accommodation? Do you want to go first, Gideon?
Sure, well, I suppose I've always had an involvement in and a passion for housing and homelessness since I decided to train as an architect. And feels like a couple of centuries ago, but a long time ago. And gosh, International Year of Shelter for the Homeless 1987, which I was an organizer of, going way back to then. So it's always been, you know, my I guess my craft, my profession was buildings, and what better use to put buildings to than a social purpose that really matters. So my interest in architecture and homelessness and housing all overlapped. Basically, homelessness is a choice. It's not inevitable. It's a choice of government. It's a choice of investors. It's a choice of budgets, and we need to take action, radical action, to bring it to an end.
Yeah.
Do you want to share a bit of your story? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah, I suppose it's the issue that brought me to politics, small p politics at the time, but kind of growing up, having to leave the community in South Ruislip that I grew up in because of homelessness, with my mum at that time, a single parent. The second time I was homeless later in our new home in Northampton, and spent time in hostels, bed and breakfast, temporary accommodation, before fortunately finally getting a council property and some security. My whole experience at that time of housing insecurity and homelessness, as I say, kind of piqued my interest in politics, trying to understand exactly why my mum, despite working 2 jobs, still couldn't afford to put electric in the meter, still couldn't afford to keep out of debt and afford to keep a roof over our head. So started asking those questions of ourselves, our situation and our country and our community, and it's what drove me to join the Labour Party originally, to get involved in politics, and ultimately to get where I am today, which is the House of Commons, which isn't a regular thing for people who've been in that situation of homelessness and insecurity in that way. And I'm keen to use the platform really now to raise that issue on the political agenda, to make sure that the new government, which has made really ambitious commitments in this area, sees them through, and kind of touching upon the kind of housing point. Prior to this, I spent 10 years in local government in Camden in central London, where the issues of homelessness and temporary accommodation, rough sleeping were really biting. One of the local authorities, massive housing waiting list, like many, huge amounts of temporary accommodation pressure, ever increasing. And I was fortunate enough to be responsible for building council homes, and we built 1,000, but it was very, very difficult in local government to keep your head above water, to do the right things. Often easier to not build council homes rather than build them, unfortunately. And again, I was keen to use that experience in local government to hopefully influence national policy as well.
Brilliant. Natalie, what about you?
I guess my contact with this has really happened only since I was elected in May 2022. I knew about homeless families, but I didn't at all understand the scale of the problem. And started to be confronted with story after story through my casework of just the most horrendous kind of situations. And then I'm sure councillors in the room will recognise these kind of stories that the homelessness team in Tower Hamlets Council was really neglected for many years. The team even threatened industrial action in the middle of last year, and the council leadership has not really kind of we've only just got to the point where we've got an interim head of service to start kind of implementing the promises that the council leadership has promised. But before that, not being able to get answers to questions that were really urgent, and then finally the truth coming out that actually those teams had inboxes of 1,200 unread emails, that many of whom were extremely urgent situations. So it's a necessity for councils. We're really at the sharp end of this problem. So we don't have any choice but to confront it. And we're really seeing also that councils are struggling financially. That we're in huge amounts of that we're sort of staring down the track of Section 114 notices, the bankruptcy notices for councils all across the country. And temporary accommodation costs is the #1 issue that is kind of tipping us over the edge. Thankfully, in Tower Hamlets, we're not looking at bankruptcy notice just yet, but just over the border in Newham, they are. They could be looking at that in 18 months. So we have no choice but to think about this now. This is a crisis now.
Yeah. So this morning we've heard a lot of stories from on the ground about the impact of temporary accommodation, particularly on children. And we've heard personal testimonies of people experiencing living in temporary accommodation. We've got the testimonies of workers who are working with people. We know there's 151,000 children at least in temporary accommodation at the moment. We know it's costing an absolute fortune. We know the outcomes are terrible. You're all from a range of political parties. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, what's your political party view of what's going on? And then I want us to think about how we collaborate, because this is never going to be solved if politicians just argue with each other. But you can start off arguing, is that all right? So I'm going to ask the government to go first, even though you're very new and you've only probably just found out how to get around the building. But what is the current government's stance as far as you understand it about temporary accommodation?
Yeah, well, I still haven't found my way around the building, to be honest. So you've got more faith in me than I have. So we've been in power for just over 100 days now.
No, we didn't know that.
Yeah, it's not been said much before. And we face a £22 billion black hole, which I'm sure you haven't heard about.
Or 40, depending how you do the maths.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult situation, and housing is one of the massive pressures, as you were touching upon, that is really putting pressure on the whole system in terms of temporary accommodation pressures on local government, on border health and educational pressures as well. In terms of the government's view about it, we need to really grasp the nettle of housing. The last government didn't have a housing strategy for 14 years. It had, I think, a minister every year for housing. At least. It's very hard to get anything done with that kind of instability. And a lot of the economic instability in the system was driving ever higher interest rates, which, again, if you're trying to build homes, deliver affordable rented homes, higher and higher interest rates are kind of countervailing that pressure. And we've seen spiraling rents and mortgages as a result, pushing more and more people into homelessness and insecurity. So restoring economic stability, bringing down interest rates and inflation is the kind of bedrock. Ultimately, delivering a new housing and homelessness strategy. It's two separate strategies. There's a 10-year homelessness strategy which is going to be produced, which I think is really welcome. And I would like to see that set quite ambitious targets around homelessness. We're looking to deal with some of the fundamental causes in the system. So whether it's the broken rental system, so our renters' rights bill has been introduced to Parliament, ending Section 21 no-fault evictions, hopefully stabilising rents, reducing that pressure on the system. My casework, probably like yours, overwhelmingly housing casework, significantly Section 21 no-fault evictions. So I think that piece of legislation is really important in terms of reforming the private rental sector, where a lot of people who fall into homelessness come from. We're also dealing with the fundamental lack of supply. There's not enough homes. Like anything, if there's not enough of it, it's going to be more expensive and harder to find. So again, we've restored housing targets, which the last government abolished. We're providing more flexibilities to councils and housing associations to build, which are much welcome. Having been there myself, there's lots of quite kind of easy wins. It's always an easy phrase to say, but there are easy wins around housing delivery. Ensuring we reform the planning system to speed up delivery. And again, we might touch upon it, but I think this is somewhere we can politically collaborate. Unfortunately, the house building is a very politically contentious issue. I'm already getting a lot of pressure in my inbox and from other parties around greenbelt reform, planning reform, which are necessary. So I think we could talk about how we collaborate around that agenda. And also the kind of social causes of homelessness, of low pay, of instability, of mental health, which are also driving a lot of this. So again, I think this week, the weeks are flying by at the moment, but this week we introduced in our first 100 days the Employment Rights Bill, which is a landmark piece of legislation to improve pay and conditions, to get rid of zero-hour contracts, and much, much more, which again, hopefully will lead to a stability for people in employment, people can maintain regular hours, better pay, and hopefully then afford rent more easily. So I'm not going to pretend that all of that means that suddenly homelessness will go away. It won't. It is something that requires a 10-year ambition because of the scale of the problem. But I think it's important to set that ambition and to try and make progress on those very knotty and significant issues, which, to be honest, have been completely ignored for 14 years, if not longer. So
I'm going to ask Gideon, who was nodding. So you are now kind of the party of competent opposition. Congratulations to the Lib Dems, who I think you had the biggest party afterwards, I think, after the election. So from your party's perspective, what would you like to see the government do? What do you think the priorities are?
Okay, well, I'll just say a little background as well, if I may. So, why did I come to the Liberal Party? So when I talked back, when I was getting involved in these issues, it was Liberals, members of the Liberal Party who are active in shelter, who I met back in the day. And the first homeless persons legislation, the first piece of legislation to give rights to homeless people, the Homeless Persons Act 1977, was actually a Liberal MP's private member's bill that would have guaranteed, would have given a duty on local authorities to house anybody who presented as homeless. The Labour government at the time took it on board. They amended it. Still a good piece of legislation, not as good as it might have been. But what's happened, not just over 14 years, actually, I would say since then, is it's been the duties for homeless people have been watered down and watered down and watered down consistently, all through obviously those of us unfortunate enough to remember the Thatcher years, all through that period and right up to today. 117,000 households in temporary accommodation is totally unacceptable. What would we be doing about that? Well, yeah, I do agree with a number of things the government are doing. So I led on the Renters' Rights Bill second reading, and I led our members through the lobby in favour of the second reading of that bill. But there is a lot more that needs to be done. And I think I pick a number of things. One is that the decent home standard that's in the new bill. So we have a decent home standard for social housing, and the bill will rightly bring in decent house standard for private rented. The Labour government are not applying that to temporary accommodation. That's plain wrong. People in temporary accommodation should have decent housing just like anyone else. So we're bringing forward an amendment on that. And hopefully, maybe have a word with his colleagues. Maybe they'll accept it. So we'll be pushing on that one. Also, the shared accommodation allowance, which devalues the amount that you can get in benefit towards your rent, should not be imposed on homeless people. They should not have to subsist on a totally inadequate level of benefits. That's the second thing. And the third thing I'll mention, as a first off at this stage is talks about delivery. You're absolutely right. I'm concerned that we could spend the next few years debating housing numbers and green belts and have lots of angry residents, and we'll go through all the same debates. And boy, I've been there. I've been in a lot of these debates over the years, and not actually get anywhere with building social and council rent houses. And that's what we need to do. I'm not frankly interested in how many houses Crest Nicholson are going to build on the edge of Taunton. we need some private housing, and you know, that needs to be facilitated. But that is not the objective. The objective has to be council and social rent housing more of it. And it's fantastic to hear your authority, what your authority's been doing. Mine in Somerset is built since the Liberal Democrats took over a couple of years ago, building the first council houses in a generation in parts of the county, in absolutely decades, building hundreds of council houses again, and zero carbon ones at that in many places. So it can be done, but councils are not able to access the borrowing they need to deliver enough new council houses. Same applies to housing associations, which have different pressures, but quite big ones. And I totally agree. I think this is an area where we should be collaborating, coordinating, because I think there is a will to deliver new social rent and council rent houses. And that's where the emphasis needs to be. And I'm all for cooperating and collaborating in Parliament and outside Parliament to try and make sure we get that given the priority it needs, and we don't spend 5 years arguing about national planning policy framework and how many houses are going in how many fields from big private developers. That's not the issue for me. The issue for me and for us as a party is building more genuinely affordable places to live. There's some more things I could say about temporary accommodation, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Natalie, the Greens are very ambitious.
We are rather ambitious, but I think we need to be. I think one of the journalists in the journalist panel said that she's anxious that the new government isn't being radical enough to address the scale of the challenge. But I think collaborating is a really powerful way that we can do that. So one of the things that we've been pushing for is, so in our national manifesto for the this year's election was 150,000 new council homes for rent in England per year, and that's it should be possible. More things are ending no fault evictions, which is in the renters is in the Renters' Rights Bill. Is it in the Renters' Rights Bill? Yes, it's in the Renters' Rights Bill. But I think ending no fault evictions can't happen in a vacuum, and there needs to be a package of measures around that to support renters, for example. So some of these measures are about long-term fixes for the sector, and some of the measures that we're looking at are short-term. What do we need right now? So the long-term measures that we're looking at are building a significant amount more council homes, ending right to buy, ending no fault evictions, and then an investment in environmental health officers to enforce the decent home standard. And some of the things that we've also been doing around renters' rights are, so the London Mayor has the powers to introduce rent controls, but they need the national government to set the level. And one of the things that we in the Green Party have been doing is trying to push the London Mayor in the GLA to set up a renters' rights commission to have a conversation with renters and potentially also with landlords, because it was also a thorny issue between renters and landlords. I would like to say it's a simple question of rebalancing the power that landlords have, but I also understand that it's not as simple as sort of slash and burn. Kind of landlords need to take responsibility, but they need to be encouraged to take responsibility for their tenants, and they need to also take responsibility for the rents that they set. But they're also set by a market. So one of the things that our Green London Assembly members are doing is to set up a rent commission for London. I think the immediate measures, though, that I'd like to hear people talk about more are the sell-off of social housing under right to buy. It has been catastrophic for like the homelessness crisis, and one of the things that we can do right now is obviously end right to buy, but another thing that we can do is invest in the right to buy back, so investing in buying back social homes that have been lost. So yeah, that's just a few things.
So I think the room, I think that there's a genuine support for more social housing, and I've been fascinated to see the government in the first 100 days slightly shift the rhetoric around building houses to building social houses, And personally, I'd like to see a proper commitment to social housing. Like, we do not need more 4-bedroom fancy houses. We need normal, sensible, affordable houses for most normal people to live in.
We need homes of all sorts. To be honest, when there's 50 people queuing up for a private renter sector property, we need homes of all sorts and all sizes in all tenures as urgently as possible. And I agree with you. Like, I've built council homes, but we need to build more homes of all sorts, and it really needs to turbocharge it. And it needs radical change in terms of. And I challenge the point: planning in this country holds back housing delivery, and I completely agree with you. I've built council homes. The government's proposals to reform right to buy, to enable grant to be used more flexibly and combined, HRA reform, which is housing revenue account reform, access to land. There's a number of changes around access to land. All of those are really important in terms of speeding up council house delivery. And we do need more grant, but fundamentally we do need more homes of all sorts. And councils don't directly construct homes. The whole housing market does need, which has collapsed, does need to be encouraged to start moving again in terms of jobs and skills. So, it's not, and I must say, like, in terms of planning reform, we're getting real pushback politically about it in constituencies like mine. And we need planning reform to build council homes, affordable rented homes, shared ownership homes, private homes.
My concern is, if we talk about homes, that the socially affordable homes are not the most commercially exciting to build. And so whenever I've seen house building at scale across the country, and I'm not an expert, but you see like nice John Lewis houses going up. But the patients that I look after are never going to live, they don't want a nice John Lewis house. They want to live where they grew up, in social housing that's secure, where they know that if they play a reasonable citizenship contract, they will live there for 5-10 years. And that's what they want. So I understand as a country we need more houses, but politically, if we don't lead for the poorest never get.
Yeah. Sorry, but unfortunately, that's not what happens. What happens is some private homes do get built, but the council homes drop out because of viability. That's just how the system works. At the moment,
is it only viability or is it choice?
No, it's the viability. At the moment, It's incredibly difficult to afford to build homes in this country for a number of reasons. It isn't just that they're all squirreling away all these profits. Actually, a lot of small, medium-sized housing companies are going bankrupt at the moment. A lot of sites are just completely stalled. There's hundreds of homes half built in my constituency that have just stopped. And actually, with housing associations aren't taking on new homes, aren't building new homes because of a variety of complex reasons. And a lot of delivery of affordable homes happens through the private sector, through Section 106 provision. So 25-35%. Because of the Mayor of London's policy, on average of 35% of homes are affordable in London on big schemes. Those schemes are completely ground to a halt. Delivery is ground up. So I love council homes. I've built them. I lived in one. I want more. But it isn't just a case of saying we want those, but not those, or we just need to prioritise those, but not those. We don't have to do the planning reform. We can just get on and fund council homes. The housing system is really broken.
Yeah, I have a couple of points.
Gideon, go on.
So look, every government has done planning reform. This government is going to do planning reform. We hear it every year. It doesn't matter who's in number 10. So if building more homes was as simple as putting a lever and changing a number in local plans, it would happen. Now, I don't disagree with everything Danny's saying. We do need to do some things to encourage private sector housing. Where I am in Somerset, they're effectively being taxed because of phosphates in the Somerset levels, which is actually a responsibility of others, as not just house builders, farming, and all sorts of other causes. So there are things to do. I don't disagree. I don't disagree looking again at planning policy, which I've done quite a lot in my life, but that for us the priority is those houses that the market won't deliver. It has to be, and not just the affordable 80% of market rent, whatever that is arguably whether that is affordable or not, but genuine social and council rent houses. The reason that I'm saying that is because the state has a particular role in, and I'm sure Danny would agree, the state has a particular role in delivering that kind of housing, and because it requires subsidy, and the biggest subsidy we could give it is the land. We need to give it free land. We need to acquire land existing use value. The land belongs to the people, as someone once said. The land at the moment, if councils own land, they can build houses, and that's, a lot of them will do that, and that makes some great projects. A lot of other councils, housing associations, getting the land is one of the biggest elements, not the biggest, one of the biggest elements of it. And so we need, and I know the Labour government is talking about this, we need to acquire that land at existing use so that money doesn't drain away to landowners who are essentially speculating. So and on that land, then we're getting a land cheaper, we can build more social and council rent houses. This seems to be a much bigger and more important project for me and for Liberal Democrats than the big house builders. Not saying we don't need to improve the private ownership market as well, but the priority for us is 150,000, same target, 150,000 council and social rent homes per year.
So for the 151,000 kids who are currently living in TA, they are not going to wait for whoever builds whatever houses. So a lot of my work is about mitigating the effect now. So some of the things that we're asking for is a minimum standard, which includes a kitchen, access to food, access to cots for every child under 2. It's in the guidance, but there's no penalty for not doing it. We're still not seeing kids sleeping in cots. We're also asking for accommodation where families are housed to not house single homeless people, because they are very different hyper vulnerable groups that mixing, particularly as we're emptying our prisons without a plan, is particularly dangerous locally. And some of the other things we're asking for is a notification system so that if a child does go into temporary accommodation, the school and the GP are told. None of those things require significant amounts of money or no money, but they do require leadership. As a group of politicians, are those the kind of things you could collaborate around whilst we sort out phosphate and planning rules and things I've never heard of before? Thoughts on kind of how do we, I guess, and then I'm going to open up to the floor. So how do we mitigate now to make it safer for kids living in TA? And short answers, because this lot want their voice.
I think those points are really, really important. And I can't believe that we're not doing those things already. One of my constituents who I helped was in a temporary accommodation in Lewisham, and she was in a block of flats that was housing predominantly single men, and she was a single mother with a very young baby, struggling with health issues. Actually, really awful situation. The postal system in the flat was basically just one big letterbox for about 80 flats. And she missed the warning letters telling her that she needed to move accommodation, and that her belongings would be impounded if she didn't respond. And then she suddenly was in, somewhere else, came back, and her belongings had been moved. She had no idea what had happened. It's absolutely awful. But the fact that she was in that house, she initially got in contact with me because she couldn't make the stairs of the property, but then obviously all these things came out. The fact that she was living in this really scary place with people who were stealing her shopping. If she left her bags at the bottom of the stairs and took her baby up, she would have to leave her shopping down at the bottom of the stairs and then go back for it. And by the time she'd gone back for it, they would be stolen.
So when we did the call for evidence APPG, and we've seen it repeatedly around the country, we know that women and girls in mixed accommodation are routinely propositioned and exposed.
Right.
We haven't yet had a reported case of actual assault that people will come and report, but we know it's happening. So there is, for me, there's an immediate safeguarding call of saying, can we just change the guidance that accommodation is not mixed? It's a logistical nightmare for councils, but they can solve it. But at the moment, there's no national leadership, and there hasn't been for years, on that issue. So the safeguarding sits with the Home Office. This is the other problem with temporary accommodation, isn't it? Safeguarding sits with the homeless, with the Home Office. Housing sits in, the Deputy Prime Minister's big box. Health sits over there. Mental health sits somewhere else. And education doesn't really know where these kids are. So we don't know how many kids are missing from education. We don't know how many kids are missing from healthcare. We don't know how many kids, we don't have reported crime data. So we are very, very siloed. So I think there's a call to work cross government, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the APPG has adopted the notification to Health and Education Services as our, and I think Siobhan, unfortunately, hopefully will make it soon. It has kind of pledge that the APG will launch that as their campaign for this year, which I think is sensible. I think it will often be a case of the how rather than the if. Anyone who's tried, my professional background was healthcare, and I'm on the health select committee. Communications between health systems are not the easiest thing in the world. Yeah, there's 4 different GP IT systems, and the hospital doesn't talk to the GP, let alone the housing prevention team in the council talking to the health system. But so these things are harder than they often seem at the start. But I think there is a will to press on this point cross-party, which I think is welcome. I mean, on the standards, I think clearly, I remember life in bed and breakfast and temporary accommodation. I remember the police raids, while we were in our room, because of drugs and other issues. So, I do see this and I see it in my inbox. I would say, I think there's obviously logically a decent home standard that should apply to all homes, including temporary accommodation. I think temporary accommodation by nature will always be slightly different practically than permanent accommodation. And if you try and apply the full permanent accommodation standards, you do sometimes end up ending the provision of temporary accommodation through loopholes. So, for instance, if you give a family a permanent residential accommodation standard of accommodation, they're not going to leave. So it wouldn't be temporary, and then you'd have no temporary accommodation supply. But clearly the homes need to be decent and safe. And so I think that that's certainly something that can be pushed on the agenda. Again, I think councils are facing a supply nightmare, and we do have to make sure we don't cut off our nose to spite our face, and we have to get the resourcing there to deliver the decent homes and the supply of decent homes, because if we don't, all that will mean is councils then can't place people in homes that don't meet the standard, and I'll have more people telling me they're being moved to Luton and Birmingham and Newcastle away from their child's special educational needs school and hospital, which is currently happening in droves. And again, if we don't have the resources and the supply, it will just mean people don't have homes to go to, and people just rough sleeping or sleeping on their friend's sofa or having to move to Luton equally is quite damaging to their life chances. So yeah, I completely agree, decent standards, but we need to get there in a managed way.
Okay,